Good evening, everyone. Hi there. My name is Michelle Garrio, and I am one of the librarians here at the Seekonk Library, and I get to welcome you to tonight's program. I'm very excited to bring this program because over the years, really these history programs have really come to mean a lot to me. I really enjoy learning about the people who we get to present locally who are from the area, and also the things that are right around us that we maybe take for granted. This is such a special area and part of the country that we're in, especially as we head into the Thanksgiving season. And of course, Bristol County, and Plymouth in particular, celebrating the 400th anniversary of the Plymouth Plantation colony, I guess, being established, I would say. So on behalf of the Seekonk Library, I welcome you. I am happy to introduce our host for tonight's program. If you don't know him, his name is David Norton. He is a longtime Seekonk resident, a retired engineer, and something of a history expert, I would say, for our area. He has done many, many historical presentations across the New England area. And right here in Seekonk, you may know him from his television work. He does have a show called Discovering New England History that shows on Seekonk local access cable, Channel 9. And it is also actually broadcast in Rhode Island as well. So he's got a wealth of information and enthusiasm, which I think that you will find very contagious. And he's going to be sharing with us a very personal Pilgrim story. Welcome, Dave Norton.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. My name's Dave Norton, and we're going to go on quite a journey here back 400 years. It's very personal for me because I'm a direct descendant of William Bradford, the Pilgrim. So my daughter did an awful lot to get that Mayflower distinctions through my side of the family. So if someone could perhaps turn the lights off in the back, it looks a lot better. There we go. Okay, John and Elizabeth Howland's story. So, to begin with, we've got John Howland, and we're going to talk about him. And of course, he's buried here on Burial Hill in Plymouth, and that's his tombstone, and that's sort of a rendition of what he probably looked like. And we'll be talking about Elizabeth Howland. And she's actually buried in Riverside, Rhode Island. So we're going to be doing quite a, there we go, quite an adventure to find out how we got to Riverside, Rhode Island. Now it all begins in Scrooby Village, England. We're going to take the full story here. William Brewster is an elder, Pilgrim elder, if you will, and that's an actual picture there of Scrooby, England, beginning in 1608. And that's where he lived, Scrooby, England, William Brewster. And William Bradford in Austerfield, England, and that's his birthplace, and that's his house also. Now, Elizabeth Tilley, she was born in 1607. That was her maiden name, okay? And that's exactly the church and the cemetery where she went. It's in Bedfordshire, England. Now, the church they all sort of got together in is St. Helena's Church. That's still there in Austerfield, England. It's about 150 miles north of London. And William Brewster there met William Bradford, and that's where basically the Pilgrims started. Now, they went to church there, but they also were separatists, and they were going against the Church of England and all the oppression that was going on there. So what they had to do is they got together at William Brewster's home in Scrooby, England, 1607, and they would have their church service, secret church services there every week. They go to the other church, and they would have their secret service right there. Now, to give you an idea why they did that, we're going back in time here. Queen Elizabeth I in England, her reign ended in 1603. and was extremely oppressive. What they did is you had to go to church every single week, and they had strict rules in England. Now, they found out that the Queen, her reign ended in 1603, and a new king, King James I. So everyone figured, finally, we've got rid of the other queen, and now things are gonna change. And they're right, they did change, but have changed even worse. These are the rules. It's amazing what you think about here. Everyone must attend church in England every single week without fail, okay? No one can hold unlawful assemblies, so that house that they were in, it was illegal right to begin with. Stealing was prohibited. Penalties, I mean, these are incredible penalties that they strictly enforce. Everyone must attend church, imprisoned or tortured until they agreed to conform. They put them in prison, and they tortured them until they said, yes, I will do everything that you want in England. Now, if you were in 3 months in prison, and let's say they would exile you if you didn't conform. If you returned to England just to see your family or something, you snuck in like that, you would be captured and executed. And if you caught stealing, they would cut 1 or 2 hands off. Just to give you an idea what's going on in England back in 1608. That's where you didn't want to go. And neighbors would turn in other neighbors. If they found out that you didn't go to your church on Sunday, they would secretly turn you into the king. They would come in, capture you, and take you right into the Tower of London. That's where you didn't want to end up. There's another great picture of the Tower of London under King James I. And down in the dungeon, there's the torture room. And that's what they did. They tortured all the people that did not conform to all the rules in England. That's where you ended up. And some of these drawings are just incredible what they would do. String you up, and they would put you up, I mean, just, the torture was amazing. And that's what the Pilgrims wanted to get away from. All this oppression, all this torture, They wanted freedom of religion, and you couldn't have it here in England. Now, this is interesting too. I took this picture here and I found out something really interesting. King James I, in order to make sure everyone complied with all these rules and regulations, right? When you went to work back and forth over London Bridge, there it is. Part of the bridge was covered bridge, all right? Right here, if you take a look, at the beginning end and at the end right here, you see an arch right here, and you see what it looks like a stick sticking up there. When you went to the Tower of London and you didn't conform, they would behead you. And every day they would be doing this, and they would put your head on top of a pole here, so when you went across the bridge and came home at night across the bridge, you would look at that, and that's a reminder. That's what the Pilgrims were faced back there in England. Now, they decided secretly that they wanted to leave screwy England and go to Amsterdam, Holland. In Holland, you could have freedom of religion. And in order to do that, all the pilgrims of the congregation, they sold all their property, pooled all their money, everything, so they could get a Dutch ship to sail. Here's Scrooby, England right here. You can see it. I made this drawing up. Right across the North Sea and over to Holland. The first time they tried to gather there and do it, neighbors turned them in and they were captured. And some of them were sent to the Tower of London. It's just amazing the way England was ruled back there. So that's what you think. Here you go. They probably saw this here when they entered Holland, all the windmills and a whole new adventure. Completely penniless because everything they had was on that ship to get across.
Excuse me, can you stand a little bit more that direction or move that thing, because you're blocking
You
all
can't
that.
see too much?
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Now, in Amsterdam, it was a completely different culture. It was a city of merchants and tradesmen, metal and leather factories, okay? Population 240,000. The separatists, of course, they were farmers. They had no money at all, but they wanted, and they did have religious freedom, but they had no skills to survive there. They stayed in Amsterdam for only 10 months, and they decided they couldn't live here, and so they moved south. And they went to Leiden, Holland. And that's a great picture, and everybody thinks that's really nice in Leiden. Well, they had problems there too. All the canals, and what they had to live in these one-room apartments. You're talking one families or two families living in these one-room apartments. And Leiden was different. It was a city of weavers. Endless canals, apartment living, but they had religious freedom. And that's a nice, great picture there. Narrow streets, industrial locations. It's totally different from what they had over in England. There's a picture there, one of the one-room apartments in Leiden, Holland. Imagine your whole family, that's it. That's it, all you had. You had nothing else. Now, they had a congregation. They elected John Robinson, who was their pastor, and they had a meet at this small church, which they established. And in Holland today, they have the Pilgrim Museum in Leiden. That's a picture of it on the corner. That's a picture from the inside looking out, just to give you an idea what Leiden was all about. Now, William Brewster in Leiden, Holland, he was the elder, if you will, the church elder. And that's where he lived. If you take a look on the right there, that door, that was his front door, and that was his front yard. You can imagine how restrictive that was. And that's one of the typical houses, rooms that they had in Leiden. And at that time now, Elizabeth Tilley, she was only 13 years old, and John Howland was 28. But she was 1 year old when she came over, so she's starting to become Dutch, more Dutch than English. And that's what they dreamed about. The pastures left behind in the world in England. Now, William Brewster, very ingenious. They made himself a printing press. And back in the day, the presses used to be wine presses. They used to squeeze the grapes, and that's how they started with the making the presses. But anyway, they adapted that to a press. And he had it with King James, so he started printing and distributing anti-King James pamphlets. And they secretly got over to England, and all England was full of these things against King James the First. Now, the English king found out about it, and they wanted William Brewster to want to capture him, try him, and hang him. So what they did was, in the different one-room apartments, every night they would sneak him in from one apartment, and he'd live in another apartment the next night, another apartment the next night, or whatever like that. That's how they had to do it, to stay away from Holland. The Dutch were actually cooperating with the English to try to go after the Pilgrims. So they went south again to a place called Delfshaven, where they're going to pool all their money and get another ship. After they stayed 12 years in Holland. The problem was their children were becoming more Dutch than they were English, and they liked the English civilization and what they grew up with, but they didn't like all the oppression. So they stayed here in this small gathering place, another church, until they could actually get a Dutch ship to go back to England to get another ship to make it across to America. So they got this ship to Speedwell, and they boarded that to make it from Delfshaven, Holland to Southampton, England, July 1620. Now, they couldn't take everyone. So John Robinson, the pastor, stayed there in Holland with quite a few of the Pilgrims. But they took many of them there. And they're going to make it across back to England, across the North Sea. Now, they got on the Speedwell, and they got on the deck there, and they all knelt down, and they gave prayer and thanks and whatever, and safe journey. Because here they are again, all by themselves. And I'll show you the route that they actually took. Here you are in Delfshaven. They got the boat. The ship came all the way down here into Southampton, where they're going to get another ship. So they crossed the North Sea, stopped at Southampton. And that's kind of a nice painting there, Southampton, England. Now it's August of 1620. And of course at Southampton, they, the captain of the ship they got, a second ship called the Mayflower, Christopher Jones. Now, during this time when they stopped in England, they had to hide William Brewster, because the English wanted to, in case he was on the ship, they wanted to capture him, try him, and hang him. And they hid him below the ship. Then they got the Mayflower, and at night they transferred William Brewster over to the Mayflower and hid him. Well, they started off. Two ships now, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. Then all of a sudden the Speedwell began to leak. So they had to put in Dartmouth, England. They didn't get very far. They put in there. And what happened was, okay, they got a minor repair done, and they both set off. Two ships set off. You can see this is the Mayflower, and this is the other ship. It started lagging way behind. It started taking on water 300 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, after all that distance, they had to make another choice. What happened on the Speedwell, they put a larger mast on it. A larger mast than they should have had on the original Speedwell, with larger sails. And what happens like that, when you get in the wind, all right, it starts moving it. And all of a sudden, where the mast is anchored on the bottom of the ship there, it started springing leaks. That's what was happening there. Now they had to make a decision. We left some of our people in Holland. Then what do we do here now? We got the Speedwell is leaking. Do we go on and let them go back to England? And if the ship sinks and all the folks drown, it's on our conscience. Or do we turn back to England? So they got together and made a decision. They're going to turn back to England. So here we are. This time they turned back to Plymouth, England. Now it's September 1620. They declared the Speedwell unfit to make the crossing. Now they had to make another choice. Who's going to stay in England and who's going to continue? Now you're going to have one ship, the Mayflower, instead of two. So they had to sort that out among themselves, and who's going to go on the Mayflower. Some stayed back in England, some stayed in England and made their way back to Holland. Difficult choices. And this, I really like this picture. This is called the Gateway to America. It's in Plymouth, England. And this arch is where they went through this arch on their way to the dock to get on the Mayflower. And I really like this shot there. So here we are. We've got Elizabeth and John Howland and the other pilgrims, 102 of them, going right through this very archway right here, going out to the dock. And there it is today. That's the actual dock where the Mayflower was docked. Those are the actual steps. You can go down those today. You go down right here, and there's the Mayflower. It's quite a historic place. You can see you got the British flag, and you also have the American flag right here. So they set sail for America. Now it's getting late now. It's October of 1620. Mayflower hits a storm at sea, in the middle of the Atlantic. Now you gotta remember, when you set out on a ship like that, you don't look at your 7-day weather forecast. That doesn't exist. You can't wait, well, you know, to do that. You don't say, well, if I get stuck, I got the Coast Guard to rescue me. That's not gonna happen. And you got Christopher Jones, the captain, had complete contempt for the Pilgrims. He thought they had no skills. He didn't want to do anything with them. His job is to take them across the Atlantic. That's all he had to do. And he never let them go up on deck. They had to stay down below deck, 102 of them, for this journey across the Atlantic. So now the main beam cracks, and you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I had this ship here. Here's the main mast right here. Just to give you an idea, the Pilgrims had to all go down in the lower decks. There's the cargo right here, and that's where they had to stay through the whole voyage. Now, I took a top view with the mast right here. Hear this beam right across here? That's cracked in half, sagged down. If they didn't fix that beam in the middle of a storm, these sides would just get crushed. So William Brewster, they had his printing press on board. They couldn't figure out how to jack up the beam and repair it. That's all they could do. So they come up with the idea of using this printing press with the jack on it, put it under the beam and try to repair it. And that's, took the jack out, there it is, and here's one deck right here, cargo hold, passenger deck. They put the jack screw down here, hooked it up to the cracked beam, which is right here, jacked it up in place, and then they put another wood column that they had underneath it, and it held. Now they did all this work in a raging storm. You can imagine, 102 people below deck getting thrown around up and down, whatever like that, and had to do all of this for complete survival in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That's an idea of what they were up against. So they continued, and they hit another storm in the Atlantic. Now, about this time, John Howland had really had it below deck. Seasick, couldn't stand it. I don't care what the situation is, I am going to go above deck and get some fresh air. And he did. You can see the pitch and the waves and everything else. So he climbs up onto the Mayflower deck. And of course Christopher Jones didn't want him to do that, but he did it anyway. So, The Mayflower started tipping from side to side, hit by a wave, threw him over into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Unbelievable. When you get a storm like that, you have to go hulling, which means you tie up the sails. If you keep the sails up, they're going to get shredded. So you tie them all up, and you got all these what they call halyards, the ropes that pull the sails up, okay? So during the storm here, all these ropes were flailing around, and here's one rope that came right down, and here's John Howland. They said he was underwater. He just reached up, and there was the rope, and he grabbed the darn rope. And they hoisted him in. That's a great picture right there. Unbelievable. Now, this William Bradford, he's the only one that wrote after the Pilgrims, and he was settled in here 1630 or something like that. He's the only one that wrote any diary or any memoirs of the whole voyage and anything, okay? That's available in one of the books that I have here that he has. It's quite a document. That's what it actually looks like today. And he wrote, it was written between 1630 and 1647, and he wrote of this incident. So I'm going to have to read this to you, because only his words really make a difference here. Here we go. In several of these storms, the wind was so strong and the sea was so high that they could not carry a knot of sail, but we were forced to haul for many days. Once as they lay at Hull in a terrible storm, a strong young man called John Howland, coming on deck, was thrown into the sea. But it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyard, which hung overboard, and ran out at length. Continuing, he kept his hold, though he was several fathoms under the water. He was under the water as they were pulling him. He was hauled up by the rope, and then with a boat hook helped onto the ship and saved. Though he was somewhat ill from it, he lived many years and became a profitable member of both the church and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. True story. 66 days at sea, 102 right below decks. Can you imagine that? Finally they see land. Any land, they would have been happy about it. But they took a look. Of course, it was up around Truro, and all barren sand dunes. Everybody knows what that area is like. This is not a place for farming. So they had to make a decision. So the captain said, "Okay, we're going to head south. We're going to head south." So instead of landing there, they started. The Mayflower turned around and went down south. And there's the route right here. He came across here, right to Truro, with the arrows. Came all the way down here, searching the whole coast for a place to settle. And then they ran in what they call Pollock Rip. It's a current where the Nantucket Sound meets the Atlantic Ocean, and the two, they crash together right here. It's the most treacherous part around Cape Cod. And here's a picture of the Mayflower. They almost lost it right there. It almost got smashed right there. So the captain said, I can't continue, because he wanted to continue on and maybe down to New York in that area. That's the area that they were heading for. So we turned around and came back up to Provincetown. Mayflower heads back north to Cape Cod. Just to give you an idea, I wanted to do this. How old were these people, you know? William Brewster at that time was 54. Christopher Jones, the captain, was 50. Miles Standish, 36. John Carver, 36. William Bradford, 30. John Howland, 28. John Alden, 21. Elizabeth Tilley. Once they signed that, they all were together. And they landed in Provincetown. And they got out, and this wasn't really the great farming territory that they wanted either. So what they did is they got Miles Standish and they set out on a small boat they had in the Mayflower called a shallop. And he was going to explore the whole inner bay, if you will, to find a better place to settle. So he left from Provincetown, went all the way down, stopped at Eastham, came all the way up here, and wow, once I saw Plymouth, that was the place, you know. It was a great harbor. It was, they could offload their ships right here. Everything in here was all nice and green, and that was it. But on the way, when they stopped at Eastham, they had a first encounter, we'll call it. And that's what it was. They got out of the ship, and they were met with the Native Americans there. And they had a little bit of a skirmish. A few shots were fired, arrows were shot. Nobody got hurt. But they decided this is really not the place to stay either. Now, here's a marker. If you go to Eastham, on that shallop was John Howland, John Chilly, and Edward Chilly. Those are Elizabeth's uncle and aunt. All three of them now, part of the story here, were on that shallop. And if you go in the parking lot up there in Eastham, you go up on a dune that's all buried in shrubs and stuff. There's the marker right here. Exactly where the Pilgrims were. Now, what they did is after they found Plymouth, they went back to Provincetown. Then they told the captain, we know a great place to settle, let's go. And so we took the Mayflower across here to Plymouth. And of course they landed in December, now we're into almost the winter, right? December 11, 1620. There's Plymouth Rock. I really enjoy this picture here, and I would almost like to believe that was Elizabeth, and they let her be the first one to step on land. Nobody will ever know that, but I would like to believe that. Unfortunately, with all the delays in England and all the ship problems and all the turning back to England and all that, hopefully they're going to get to America and be able to plant so they could have food. And obviously you're not going to plant anything in December 11th. So that really hurt them. So the winter of 1621, they had to build houses. So they cut trees down, and in order for survival, they didn't have the houses built yet, so they would work here on land to construct the houses. Then they would have to go at night back on the Mayflower to sleep over. That's how they did it. And they were also very resourceful, because in the Mayflower, for one of the items that they used for ballast, had kegs full of nails. So you wondered how they put their houses together with all those nails. That's how. They had many, many kegs full of nails down here, and that's what they used when they made their cabins. And this is a great picture. It shows them trying to get these things done before the real hard winter comes upon them. Now, Leiden Street, they call it, named after where they were in Howland and Leiden for 12 years. And this is a great picture here. They finally finished putting up all these shelters in Plymouth. And here comes the winter. That's a one-room house. There it is. They're all having supper here. Several families were in each one of these in order to do it. So Elizabeth and John, you can imagine what they had to get through on this winter now. If you go up on Leiden Street today, there's this house right here. On the sidewalk, the site of the Howland house, they put this right in the sidewalk. On this lot stood the first house of the Mayflower Pilgrim, John Howland. So right here on the sidewalk, if you stand there, you're standing exactly where his house was. If you go up the street, I think there's a bank right on the corner of Main Street. Well, anyway, you can imagine Elizabeth Tilley fetching water at the Pilgrim Spring. And that was an active spring way up into the, I think, the 1920s. But anyway, right there you can see this monument here. This would be an active spring, Pilgrim Spring. That's probably what it looked like in the day, with a crank and a bucket and whatever. So you can imagine Elizabeth Tilley coming up there filling the bucket. So next time you go to Plymouth and you see that, you're standing right where Elizabeth Tilley used to stand and fetch water every day. Here comes the winter. They had a bravest winter, and they said it was one of the worst winters they've ever had in Plymouth. But they still had freedom of religion. There's a picture in the snow, and they conducted their own services every Sunday. Now, the winter was over, but look what Elizabeth Tilley had to go through during the winter. There was 102 pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower. 42 died in this winter. Actually, 45, excuse me, 45 died this winter. They died of cholera, typhus, smallpox, or the plague. And where they were buried, if you go to Plymouth, there's this monument right here with the names of the 45 that didn't make it through the winter. I circled this in red. And of course, who died here was Elizabeth Tilley, her uncle, her aunt, and her mother and her father. So she buried all four of them in the first winter in Plymouth. And she's still only a teenager. Spring comes. All of a sudden, a Wampanoag, unannounced, walks into the middle of the where the pilgrims are, and he said in English these words, probably the most famous words in the country: "Welcome, Englishmen." And they didn't know what to make of all of this, but they had to survive. And we'll go to the next item here. And this is how they knew they had to survive. This is probably, to me, the most dramatic picture you can see. Okay? Here's John, here's Elizabeth, and the Mayflower, Captain Jones, he was just going to dump them off in December before the winter and head back to England. That's part of his contract. He fulfilled it. He's out of here. They pleaded with him to stay at least until the spring so we could use the Mayflower to stay on where we make our homes and all that. He wanted none of it. What happened was 45 died. There was all this disease going through, and it affected them too. The crew on his crew on the Mayflower got sick, so he didn't have enough to go across to England until they got well, or whatever their fate was. And that's why that's an important item to note. Otherwise, everything would have, who knows what would have happened. But spring comes, and this painting just amazing. Here's all the pilgrims in Plymouth. Back on the horizon, I circled it, is the Mayflower heading back to England. Think about this. 45 out of 102 died in the winter. The captain says, "I've got to go," finally. They sit there watching the ship disappear into the horizon. They're all by themselves in America. That's it. They have no ship to get home. That's it. They have to make it work. So, here's what they did. In March of 1621, Massasoit and the Braves befriended the Pilgrims. They sat down and they had a treaty. In other words, if Massasoit was attacked by the Narragansetts, the English would help the Wampanoags defend. If the reverse happened, the English got attacked, then the Wampanoags would help in that instance. They worked together in harmony for 50 years. Squanto came. There he is, famous picture showing the Pilgrims how to plant corn. And look how great it was. They worked together. First Thanksgiving. No, it wasn't in November. It was in October, 1621. There's the harvest, and Thanksgiving, that's where it started as we know it today. Now, John and Elizabeth finally got married. We don't know the date, there's no record of it, but around 1624. He was 32 and she was 17. She was still a teenager. Got to remember, she lost her mother, her father, her aunt, and uncle. So she moved in with John Howland and the Carvers for survival. They got to know each other, and then they finally got married. Then they moved. In 1638, they expanded. Of course, they had quite a few kids. I think she had 11 children. Then they moved way out in the west here, in Kingston, Massachusetts. That was in the west. And they put up a house like this, and that's where they stayed for many years. Rocky Nook, Kingston, Massachusetts. They have a stone in their house. What is that? So I finally found the picture. One wall of the house is all made of stone. That's the whole fireplace, the whole wall. That's what it is. That's what they call a stone-ender house. That's what they had in Kingston. There she is, there he is. They're sewing. They lived there quite comfortably for many years. Then John Howland died. He was 80 years old, and he buried up here on Burial Hill. Once again, the things that Elizabeth Howland went through, just amazing, amazing story. Here she is, all alone now, out in the wilderness, if you will. She was 66 years old, and they stayed in this house for 37 years. Now, they only had two of her sons living with them at the time. One was Isaac, one was Joseph. One was 23, one was 35, living in his house at the time. Now we get into the next generation here, and we're starting to get into problems here with King Philip's War. And one night, here in Kingston, the Wampanoags attacked their home. They got out just in time, Elizabeth, Joseph, and Isaac, and they completely burned their home right down to the ground. Once again, Elizabeth and their two sons survived. This was in 1675, the start of the area of famous King Philip's War. So they moved here. One of her other sons, Jabez Howland, he had this house in Plymouth. It's on Main Street in Plymouth, and it's still there today. So Elizabeth, Joseph, and Isaac moved into this house that was destroyed in moved in this house, they lived in here in 1675. And that house is still today. It's incredible. I went through that house. Amazing. The very, very, the historical society that runs this house here, they'll help you out. just terrific place to visit, right on the main street in Plymouth. And this is the only house where obviously the two of the original Pilgrims actually lived, and actually they said that their voices were actually heard in the walls of this house, which is amazing. So that's John and well, John died, but Elizabeth was in there. That is a great house to go through. I took some pictures when I was in there. They let me do this. I asked for permission. They let me go in the house. And there's a big fireplace here, original. Like a lot of these colonial houses, they've added on a few sections over the years, but that's the original portion of the house. There's another room here with a fireplace, and now the family was getting older. They wanted their own home, obviously, so she had another daughter, Lydia Brown, and the daughter lived in, it's now Riverside, but back then it was Swansea, Massachusetts, okay? And that's where Elizabeth stayed with her daughter. I don't have a picture of the house. I don't think anything like that even exists, but this is a typical farmhouse area. I think it's a pretty good representation of what we're looking at. So she actually was living in Riverside, Rhode Island. Now, what's left? What's left to see of this story? Well, I did one of my adventures to try to find out where the original Howland house was, and we actually found it. You can't see it from the road. My son-in-law saw it. He was looking out one window, I was looking the other way. He saw it. I said, wait a minute, there's something going on up here. And so we found it. We walked up this hill, and there's a nice monument with a picture of the Mayflower here. Okay. And we said, my gosh, this is it. It was the middle of August, and we walked around there. There's a group of people. They had all these sifts, and they were going through the soil, and what in the world's going on? They were actually doing looking for artifacts. And I asked them, who's authorizing this or whatever. It's on private property, and the owner let them do it. And they come from the University of, I believe it was Virginia. Every summer they come up there to Kingston with a group of students, and they do an archaeological dig, which is really fascinating. They found a lot of things like clay pipes, and they found jaws of pigs, which they probably had roasted pigs or whatever. They're finding all kinds of things here. And of course, that's the house that was burnt right to the ground. And if you go there, though, look at this. The front door. They put this board right here, which would have been the front door. So it would actually come right into the front door, and this whole area here would be the house. And I said, well, wait a minute, it's a stone ender. Where was the hearth? There it is. You can see the whole length of the house. It's a small house. And that's still lit today. You can actually go to Kingston, Massachusetts, out in the woods, find exactly where John and Elizabeth lived for all those years, and stand right there where their hearth is, their fireplace. Okay, everybody wants to know, that's nice, but what happened to the Mayflower? It came all the way back to England with Christopher Jones, and after another year or so, it was deemed unfit. Destroy it. What they would do back there in England now, in all these ships, the farmers would purchase them for a nominal fee, And then you can see right here, they were just dismembering them because they wanted all the wood. They wanted all this wood, okay? So I said, well, that's a great picture there. That's actual Mayflower, and it shows them there. You got their horses there and whatever, and there they are. They're taking it all apart. Okay, that's probably what happened to the Mayflower, but it gets even better. The farmer made it into a barn, which still exists today. And that's the inside of his barn, and those are all the members of the Mayflower. The actual wood Mayflower over in England. And a lot of folks don't know that. Buckinghamshire, England, 1624. They did all the records. You know, a lot of people, well, we don't know about this. If you look on YouTube under a fellow by the name, a lot of you probably heard of him, Paul Harvey. He did one of his, you know, can you believe this type of thing, and he did all that stuff. What they did was, first of all, they checked when this barn was built, and they got the records. As, oh my gosh, it's the right time where the Mayflower was taken apart. They got all the documentation that it was sold to this farmer. And when they went inside here, you can't believe it. They said they took the actual, an inspection here, the actual wood here, the actual was stamped where it was actually put together at a shipyard in England at the same time. And hard to believe. They took a look at this beam right here. Yeah, I think that's it. It was cracked. Exactly where it was cracked on description on a Mayflower and the ocean. Amazing. Okay, we're just going to wind this up a little bit here. John Howland gravesite, if you visit that, great place to do study about the Pilgrims. And that's up on Burial Hill, Plymouth. And that's his gravestone. If you want to know Elizabeth Howland, that's a great painting, portrait. But here in Plymouth, it's called the Plymouth Maiden. Historians disagree who it represents or whatever. It's either John Alden's wife, or it's Elizabeth Howland. And I like to think it was Elizabeth Howland. Nobody will know for sure.
So Holland.
Based on what she looks like, her age, and whatever like that. I like to think it was Elizabeth Howland. But she's buried in, here's the entrance here, the ancient Little Neck Cemetery in Riverside, one of the oldest cemeteries, and that's her headstone right there. And I know, it's just amazing. I mean, what that woman went through, if you think about that. You know, hiding in Scrooby, England, and church services and everything when she was young, and then going to Leiden, Holland for 12 years over in Holland, then going on the Mayflower across the Atlantic Ocean, and her husband getting washed overboard, and finally getting their own home in Kingston, Massachusetts, and having it burnt to the ground in King Philip's War, surviving that, moving into this house in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which still stays today, and then leaving there and moving into Riverside, Rhode Island. That's long been destroyed. It's just an incredible story. And there's her final resting place. She was 80 years old, born 1607, died in 1687. 80 years old, Elizabeth Howland. So if you go to Riverside and you find that old cemetery, now you know her story.
Do you know where the cemetery is in Mason?
And that's the end of the story here. I guess we can put the lights on. One last thing here. I had some books here. People say, well, where do you get all this information, you know? This is great. Nathaniel Philbrook, the Mayflower. That's where a lot of this story I got. I met the author because I taught a 10-week course on King Philip's War at the in Providence, and that was quite an event to do that. I enjoyed that. This is the other one, King Philip's War.
Got it.
Okay, and I have a good friend of mine now is Michael Togus. And King Philip's War, that was something I did when I retired. I actually visited 44 sites, King Philip's War sites, all over New England, in every state. Took pictures of them and everything. I've done presentations on that too. I really enjoyed doing that. Found them all. This is great.
If you went to North Africa.
My ancestor, William Bradford, of Plymouth Plantation, and it's done in English. They say the original. The story of this was that's another amazing story too. I mean, when he wrote the manuscript, it was lost for many years. Thought it was gone. During, for some reason, it still ended up in Massachusetts. Ended up in the tower of one of the libraries there or something, buried for years. Somebody found it. It survived the Revolutionary War, and then somebody found it. The British found it, I guess, when they were in Boston. Then the British, then they took it over to England, and they kept it there as a trophy for war. Then they had to go fight it for our country and their country, who owns it and whatever. Finally came back. It's now in the Boston Library, by the way, under lock and key. Well, the story about that is amazing because they found in the book the only handwritten copy of the Mayflower Compact that he had. That would have been lost to history. But all of that's right in here.
That only.
And this one here, I cannot say enough about this. I'm plugging a story, right? If anyone has seen this, the Plymouth Adventure.
Yes.
It's the only movie Hollywood did, to my knowledge, on the Pilgrims. It was done in 1952. They spared no expense, full color. Starred, it was up for an Academy Award. A lot of people don't know. Starred Spencer Tracy, Gene Tierney, Van Johnson, Lloyd Bridges. Wow. And it covers the whole thing from leaving Southampton, England, the voyage across the Atlantic and landing in Plymouth. Full color. It's all been redigitized. I mean, I got it on Amazon for $15. How do you beat that? Unbelievable. I mean, this says it all. It's an excellent movie. If you see it, I have to tell you this. Hollywood made one mistake. Now you all know, since you've been here. The mistake they made was the fellow overboard. They did a little drama there because the main story was on William Bradford, and they said William Bradford went overboard. He did not. He did not. It was John Howland. But they did that as Hollywood for the story. But I can't, this is amazing. But I have, I'm lucky, they let me do my show, Discovering New England History, on Channel 9 in Seacock. It's been on now for about 8 years now, I guess. It's shown every day. It's a great thing. If you want to look up, or even a copy of this show that we have right here, I've done this whole thing in more detail, because I had to reduce it a little bit for what I'm doing tonight. It's in more detail. The story really expands. I did it, which is on, you can get that. It's also on YouTube too. If you go Discovering New England History, my name, David Norton, it shows on my show. But on this particular one, I did it on 4 episodes, each one half an hour. So that's 2 hours of this. I know it's going to be a long winter this year, something folks can look at. So that's about it for my presentation.